Cambodia flips in 1975. China gets a door, America gets shut out. A historical thriller told straight, with zero myth-making. If you want a clean turning point in Cold War Asia, you don't start with a treaty. You start with a helicopter. Because in April 1975, Cambodia didn't just change governments. It changed who had access, who had leverage, who got to speak in the room, and who was left outside knocking on a locked door. This is the story of how Cambodia flipped in 1975, and why that flip created an opening for China, while the United States, exhausted, retreating, and politically boxed in, was effectively pushed out of the game. No conspiracy, no cartoon villains, just hard power, geography, timing, and decisions that couldn't be undone. Part 1. The Setup. A country already in free fall. To understand 1975, you have to understand that Cambodia didn't collapse in a day. It collapsed in layers. Back in 1970, Cambodia's political balance snapped. Prince Norodom Sihanouk, who had tried to keep Cambodia neutral, was removed in a coup. A new government formed under Lon Nol and declared the Khmer Republic. What mattered geopolitically was this. Cambodia's internal crisis became tied to the wider war next door. Vietnam was already burning, and Cambodia became part of the same regional storm. The insurgency that would become famous as the Khmer Rouge grew stronger through the early 1970s. Some fighters were Cambodian communists. Some were rural recruits pulled by anger, fear, and survival. And a crucial political factor entered the story. Sihanouk, living in exile, aligned himself with the insurgency as a symbol, giving the rebellion a kind of national cover it didn't have before. So by the time you reach 1974 and early 1975, Phnom Penh is not a capital at war. It's a capital being squeezed. Food is tight. Fuel is tight. Morale is thin. Refugees crowd the city. And the government's lifeline is largely in the air. Supplies flown in to keep the place running. The United States had been involved in the region for years, but by 1975, America's posture is different. Vietnam has become a national trauma. Congress is skeptical of more escalation. Public support for Southeast Asia is evaporating, and Washington's tolerance for open-ended commitments is basically gone. That's not a moral judgment. That's a political reality. And that reality sets up the flip. Part 2. The Helicopter. Leaving the table before the city falls. On April 12, 1975, the United States carried out an emergency evacuation of Phnom Penh. Helicopters lifted American personnel and others out of the city. And here's the key point for your betrayal/twist style storytelling. This wasn't only a rescue mission. It was a signal. It told everyone watching, the Khmer Rouge, neighboring governments, China, Vietnam, the Soviet Union, that the United States had reached the end of its rope in Cambodia. When a great power evacuates its embassy under threat, it's not just leaving a building, it's leaving a position. No embassy means no routine intelligence flow, no leverage through aid, no day-to-day diplomatic contact, no channel to shape the next government. In geopolitics, access is power, and Washington just gave up access. 5 days later, on April 17, 1975, Khmer Rouge forces entered Phnom Penh and took control. So the flip happens in a brutally simple sequence.
America leaves, then the regime changes. And when the regime changes, the new rulers decide who gets in. Part 3. The shock. The war is over, and then the city empties. Imagine being a civilian in Phnom Penh that morning. Years of fighting, years of fear. Then you see soldiers entering the city and you think, maybe this is the end.
But within hours, the reality becomes something else entirely. The Khmer Rouge began ordering people out of the city. Hospitals, schools, markets, whole neighborhoods. The forced evacuation of Phnom Penh wasn't a side effect. It was policy. Part of a radical plan to dismantle urban life and rebuild society according to their revolutionary vision. And from the outside world's perspective, that single decision changes everything. Because it tells every foreign capital, this isn't a normal regime. This is a regime that will not operate like the old one. It will not be negotiated with like the old one. And it might not even want outsiders around. So who can reach them now? Who can talk to them? Who can influence them? Who can deliver assistance, recognition, and support? The United States can't, not in any meaningful way. America has no embassy, no trusted channel, no relationship with the new rulers. Washington is not just unwelcome, it is absent. In a story about being shut out, this is the lock clicking into place. Part 4. The door. Why China had access when America didn't. Now we get to the part people love to oversimplify, so let's keep it clean. China did not control the Khmer Rouge. China did not run Cambodia like a remote-controlled puppet. The Khmer Rouge made its own choices, often brutal, often irrational, often catastrophic. But China did have something the United States did not have in 1975, a working relationship. China had supported Cambodian communist forces during the Civil War, and after 1975, China became the Khmer Rouge regime's most important external backer, providing aid, training, advisors, and political support. Why? Because 1975 isn't just Cambodia flips. It's also the moment the regional balance turns into a rivalry inside the communist world. Vietnam is rising and becoming more powerful, and Vietnam's closest great power partner is the Soviet Union. China, meanwhile, is in a bitter split with the Soviet Union. So in Beijing's strategic imagination, Southeast Asia is not a map of friends. It's a map of threats and buffers. Vietnam looks like a Soviet-aligned heavyweight on China's southern flank. Cambodia, under the Khmer Rouge, looks like a possible counterweight. So Beijing has incentives to support Phnom Penh, not because Beijing loves Khmer Rouge ideology in every detail, but because Beijing wants a regional balance that checks Vietnam. That's the door. China can show up with aid and legitimacy. China can host leaders. China can provide technical assistance. China can speak to the regime as an ally. And in Cold War terms, that is what influence looks like. Meanwhile, the United States is still recovering from Vietnam's final collapse in 1975. Washington has domestic constraints. Washington has limited appetite for new missions. And Washington has no foothold in Cambodia. So America is not just weaker. America is structurally excluded. Part 5. The flip is not only about Cambodia. It's about the region. If you zoom out, 1975 is a cascading year. Saigon falls at the end of April 1975. Laos is shifting. Cambodia has already flipped on April 17th. The whole region looks like it's sliding out of America's hands. That makes Washington even more careful about what it can and can't do. But here's the twist that makes the story dramatic. Even while America is out, it still gets dragged back into the consequences. Because shortly after Cambodia falls, a separate incident lights up the headlines. The Mayaguez incident in May 1975, involving a U.S. merchant ship seized by Khmer Rouge forces. The details are complicated and debated, and the event is tragic. But the takeaway for our story is clear. Even without an embassy, even without real access, Cambodia can still force America into reaction.
That's the nightmare of being locked out. You don't get to shape outcomes, but you can still pay costs.
Part 6. What being shut out really means: leverage, legitimacy, and information. Let's translate "America got shut out" into concrete pieces. 1. Diplomatic presence. No embassy means no formal channel, no day-to-day bargaining, no routine crisis management. 2. Intelligence. When you don't have people on the ground, you rely on second-hand information, refugees, intercepted signals, foreign reports. That makes you slower and less precise. 3. Aid and influence. In many places, money and assistance buy access, but the Khmer Rouge didn't want Western aid in the normal sense, and America wasn't in a position to offer anything attractive to them anyway. 4. Legitimacy. The Khmer Rouge regime wanted recognition in international spaces. China could help with that, politically and diplomatically. America wasn't going to champion them.
So Cambodia's new government leaned into the support networks that existed. And then there's the most important piece. In 1975, the United States has no seat at the table to shape how Cambodia relates to Vietnam. China does. And that matters because, behind the scenes, Cambodia and Vietnam are already sliding toward conflict. The Khmer Rouge leadership distrusts Vietnam deeply. Border clashes and hostility grow after 1975. The relationship deteriorates. And by 1978, Vietnam invades Cambodia and topples the Khmer Rouge regime, installing a new government. So if you're making a series, this episode is the front door to a larger arc. 1975 creates a China-backed Cambodia. 1978 to 79 brings Vietnam's invasion. 1979 triggers China's war with Vietnam. But in this episode, we stay with the core truth. 1975 is when access switches hands. Part 7. No myth-making. What China could and could not do. This is where people push sloppy narratives, so we won't. China's support did not mean China commanded Khmer Rouge decisions. The Khmer Rouge pursued extreme domestic policies on their own terms, including massive forced relocations, repression, and violence. China's influence was real: aid, training, technical support, international backing. But influence has limits. Even a patron can't always steer a client if the client is ideologically rigid or internally paranoid. So the honest historical framing is this: China gained the ability to engage and support the regime. China gained leverage relative to other outsiders. But China did not rewrite Khmer Rouge ideology. And America? America had almost no lever at all. Part 8. Why this feels like a betrayal story, even without one villain. Now let's talk about the vibe you want. Expose, flip, reversal. Here's the emotional truth. For people who believed America would protect Cambodia from falling, the evacuation feels like abandonment. For people who believe Cambodia might stabilize under the old government, April 17th feels like a door slamming shut. And for America itself, there's a bitter twist. Washington leaves to avoid being trapped in a losing situation, and then watches a new order rise that it can't shape, while a rival power gains access. It's not the Hollywood kind of betrayal with one handshake and a secret knife. It's the real-world kind. A power retreats, and the vacuum gets filled. Part 9. The China gets a door moment in plain English. If you want one sentence to summarize this episode for your channel, it's this. In 1975, the Khmer Rouge took Phnom Penh and closed Cambodia to the United States, while China became the outside power with the access and the channel. That's the door. China could walk into Phnom Penh's new reality. America couldn't. Part 10. Closing. The lesson of 1975. Here's what Cambodia in 1975 teaches without preaching. Access is power. Presence is leverage. And when you exit a country in crisis, you don't just lose a battle. You lose your ability to bargain with what comes next. Cambodia didn't just change color in 1975. It changed who got to speak. China gained a relationship it could use for its regional strategy, mainly as a counterweight in a Southeast Asia reshaped by Vietnam and the Soviet Union. The United States, battered by Vietnam and constrained at home, was not only outmatched, it was outside. And the most unsettling part, even when you're outside, history can still knock on your door. Because in the Cold War, being shut out didn't mean you were safe. It just meant you were blind. That's the story of Cambodia's flip in 1975. Not a myth, not a meme, a turning point where the map changed and the room got smaller. Part 4b. Why Phnom Penh leaned toward Beijing, even if it didn't belong to Beijing. To understand why China had a door, you also have to understand why the Khmer Rouge didn't want certain other doors. The Khmer Rouge were fiercely nationalist. They distrusted outside control, and they distrusted Vietnam in particular. That wasn't just ideology, it was history and geography. Cambodia is the smaller country next to a larger neighbor. Centuries of conflict and fear live in that memory. So when Khmer Rouge leaders looked at Vietnam, they didn't see brother revolutionaries. They saw a rival with a long reach. At the same time, Vietnam in the 1970s had a growing relationship with the Soviet Union, and China's relationship with the Soviet Union was hostile. So Cambodia becomes a chess square where two communist power centers pull in different directions. Vietnam's orbit is increasingly Soviet-linked. China wants to block Soviet influence in Southeast Asia. Cambodia, under the Khmer Rouge, positions itself against Vietnam. In that triangle, China is the patron that fits Cambodia's posture. China can offer weapons, training, advisors, and aid. China can offer diplomatic cover, And China can do it in a way that does not require Cambodia to align with Moscow. That's how the door works in practice. Not mind control, but access plus alignment of interests. And this is why 1975 matters. Because once Cambodia flips, the triangle hardens. The US is out. China is in. Vietnam is watching. And the fuse is already burning. Part 5B. What America lost when it lost the embassy. Here's the part people don't always realize. The embassy is not just a building. It's an instrument. When the U.S. evacuated Phnom Penh, it lost an official channel to negotiate, a platform to gather information, a way to protect local partners, and a tool to shape the story internationally. From that moment on, Washington's view of Cambodia becomes indirect. You're listening to refugees. You're reading reports from neighboring countries. You're piecing together signals from far away. And when you don't have eyes on the ground, you're always late. That doesn't mean America stopped caring. It means America lost the ability to act with precision. So when the Khmer Rouge regime closed itself off, America didn't have a way to talk it down, or trade, or influence, or even verify information quickly. In geopolitical terms, that is what it means to be removed from the board. Not that you stop existing, but that you stop steering. Part 6B. The Long Shadow. How 1975 sets up the next explosions. Even though this episode is about 1975, the reason it matters is what it sets up. After 1975, Cambodia and Vietnam spiral toward open conflict. Border violence and hostility grow. The Khmer Rouge regime becomes increasingly aggressive and paranoid. In late 1978, Vietnam invades Cambodia and topples the Khmer Rouge government, installing a new regime. Then, in 1979, China launches a brief war against Vietnam. You can tell that whole arc as a trilogy. Episode 1, Cambodia flips and America leaves. Episode 2, Vietnam intervenes and redraws the map. Episode 3, China hits Vietnam and sends a message. But the first domino is 1975, because 1975 is when Cambodia becomes a battleground not just of ideology, but of alliances. And if you're telling this story the way you like, reversals, betrayals, doors closing, here's your sharp ending. America didn't lose Cambodia in a single battle. America lost Cambodia when it lost presence. China didn't win Cambodia by occupying it. China gained Cambodia by being the power that still had a relationship when the room emptied. That's the cold truth of geopolitics. Sometimes the winner is simply the one who still has a key.